The crimson dawn of Kepler 442c cast long shadows across the administrative district of New Geneva, once the jewel of the Intergalactic Empire's outer rim territories. Captain Malaysia Thorne stood at the observation deck of the ISV Constellation, watching the planet through the reinforced transparency viewport, her reflection ghost-like against the starfield beyond. The site below should have been one of bustling commerce and peaceful colonial life. Instead, she witnessed the systematic dismantling of everything the Empire had built over 3 centuries. Goblin war machines crawled across the surface like metallic parasites, their angular forms stark against the planet's rust-colored landscape. Massive extraction platforms had sprouted where the capital's spires once reached toward the heavens, their drilling apparatus boring deep into the planet's core in search of the precious trilithium deposits that had made this world so valuable to the Empire. Captain Thorne to the briefing room. The ship's intercom crackled, jolting her from her dark reverie. Malaysia straightened her midnight blue uniform, the silver captain's insignia on her collar catching the amber light from the corridor's illumination strips. At 34, she was young for a captain, but her record spoke for itself. 5 successful deep reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines, 3 commendations for valor, and a reputation for getting impossible jobs done. Her olive skin bore the telltale pale scar along her left temple, a memento from her first encounter with Goblin forces during the Sigma Draconis incident. The briefing room hummed with tension as she entered. Admiral Chen Zhao, commander of the Third Fleet, stood at the head of the holographic display table, his weathered face etched with the weight of command. Beside him, Director Sarah Cross of Imperial Intelligence reviewed data on her tablet, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her perpetually stern expression. "Captain." Admiral Zhao nodded as she took her seat. "Thank you for joining us. I trust you've reviewed the preliminary reports?" "Yes, sir. The Goblin hegemony moved faster than our intelligence predicted. The entire Kepler system fell in less than 72 hours. Malaysia's voice carried a professional calm that belied the anger simmering beneath the surface. She had friends on those worlds, colleagues who might be dead or worse, enslaved in the Goblin mining operations. Director Cross leaned forward, her pale blue eyes intense. "The speed of their assault suggests they had inside intelligence. Someone gave them detailed information about our defensive positions, patrol schedules, and the location of the trilithium reserves." The holographic display shifted, showing the 3-dimensional structure of Kepler 442c. Red markers indicated Goblin installations, while blue zones marked areas still under Imperial control, precious few and shrinking by the hour. "The situation is worse than our initial reports indicated," Admiral Zhao continued. "The Goblins aren't just occupying Kepler 442c for its resources. They're turning it into a fortress. Long-range sensors have detected the construction of what appears to be a major naval shipyard in the planet's northern hemisphere." Malaysia studied the display, noting the strategic positioning of the Goblin defenses. "They're planning to use it as a staging ground for further expansion into Imperial space." "Precisely." Cross activated another layer of the hologram, revealing supply lines and troop movements. "If they complete this installation, they'll have a forward operating base within striking distance of 12 major Imperial systems, including the industrial complexes at Tau Ceti and the agricultural worlds of the Centauri cluster." The implications were staggering. The Intergalactic Empire, despite its name, was not truly intergalactic. It encompassed roughly 3,000 star systems within a sphere of influence spanning nearly 200 light-years. But within that sphere, it was the dominant power, maintaining peace and prosperity for over 4 billion citizens across hundreds of worlds. The Goblin hegemony, by contrast, was a militant confederation of cyborg-enhanced aliens from the galactic rim, driven by an insatiable hunger for raw materials and territorial expansion. "What about the civilian population?" Malaysia asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Admiral Zhao's expression darkened. "Approximately 2 million colonists. Those with useful skills have been pressed into forced labor. The rest..." He gestured helplessly. "The Goblins don't take prisoners they can't use." The room fell silent except for the subtle hum of the ship's life support systems. Malaysia felt her jaw clench. The Empire prided itself on protecting its citizens, but sometimes the arithmetic of war was brutally simple, sacrificing a few to save many. Which brings us to why you're here, Captain, Director Cross said, calling up a new set of data. We need someone to get onto that planet, gather intelligence on their defensive capabilities, and identify potential weaknesses we can exploit. A full-scale assault is out of the question, Admiral Bao added. They've positioned orbital defense platforms equipped with graviton pulse cannons. Any fleet we send would be decimated before reaching effective weapons range. Malaysia nodded, studying the tactical displays. The Goblin defensive strategy was sophisticated, overlapping fields of fire, redundant shield generators, and what appeared to be a network of underground bunkers connected by transport tunnels. What's our insertion method? Cross smiled for the first time since Malaysia had known her, though it wasn't a pleasant expression. That's where it gets interesting. We've identified a window of opportunity during the changing of their orbital patrol schedules. There's a 17-minute gap every 43 hours when their sensor coverage has a blind spot near the planet's magnetic south pole. 17 minutes, Malaysia repeated. That's cutting it close. The insertion vehicle will be a modified Type 7 reconnaissance pod, equipped with adaptive camouflage and a complete sensor dampening package. Once you're on the surface, you'll have to rely on your own resources. Admiral Zhao activated another display showing the surface of Kepler 442c. The good news is that the planet's atmosphere is breathable for humans, and the gravity is only about 90% of Earth's standard. The bad news is that the Goblins have established checkpoints throughout the major population centers and maintain regular patrols in the wilderness areas. What about extraction? Malaysia asked. We'll establish a pickup point here. Cross indicated a location in the planet's southern mountain range, approximately 200 kilometers from the primary target zone. You'll have a maximum of 72 hours to complete your reconnaissance and reach the extraction point. And if something goes wrong? Admiral Zhao and Director Cross exchanged glances. Then you're on your own, Captain. We can't risk a rescue mission that might compromise the larger operation. Malaysia had expected as much. Deep reconnaissance was inherently a one-way ticket unless everything went according to plan, and in her experience, nothing ever went according to plan. I'll need a complete intelligence package, she said. Everything we know about Goblin technology, their command structure, patrol patterns, and any weakness in their equipment or tactics. Already being prepared, Cross replied. You'll also be equipped with the latest stealth gear and emergency supplies. The technical team is modifying a neural interface headset that should allow you to tap into Goblin communication networks if you can get close enough to one of their command posts. What's the timeline? Admiral Zhao checked his chronometer. The next insertion window opens in 36 hours. That gives us time to finalize preparations and brief you on the specific mission parameters. Understood, sir. Malaysia stood, her mind already racing through the challenges ahead. What exactly are we looking for down there? Director Cross brought up a final display, a detailed schematic of what appeared to be a massive industrial complex. This is the primary trilithium extraction facility. Intelligence suggests they're not just mining the planet's natural deposits. They may be attempting to synthesize trilithium using some kind of exotic matter converter. If successful, it would give them effectively unlimited access to the Empire's most critical strategic resource. Trilithium was the backbone of Imperial technology, used in everything from faster-than-light drives to quantum computers to the massive fusion reactors that powered entire star systems. The Empire's monopoly on trilithium refinement had been one of the key factors in maintaining peace and stability across known space. If the Goblins could produce their own, we need to know if this facility exists, where it's located, and how heavily defended it is. Admiral Zhao continued. This intelligence will determine whether we attempt a surgical strike or... He didn't finish the sentence, but Malaysia understood. The alternative to a surgical strike would be a planetary bombardment that would kill millions of Imperial citizens along with the Goblin invaders. I'll get you your intelligence, Admiral, Malaysia said. Count on it. As she left the briefing room, Malaysia caught her reflection in the polished metal of the corridor walls. The woman looking back at her seemed determined, professional, and utterly confident. Inside, however, she felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that came before every dangerous mission. In 36 hours, she would be alone on a hostile world, surrounded by an enemy that showed no mercy to captured Imperial personnel. She made her way to her quarters, a modest but comfortable cabin that had been home for the past 3 years. The walls were decorated with images from her travels across the Empire, the crystal spires of New Avalon, the floating cities of Kepler 186f, the vast solar collector arrays orbiting Alpha Centauri b. Each image represented not just a place she had visited, but people she had met, lives that were now threatened by the Goblin expansion. Malaysia activated her personal terminal and began reviewing the preliminary intelligence reports. The Goblins were a cybernetic species, roughly humanoid but modified with mechanical implants that enhanced their strength, endurance, and sensory capabilities. Their technology was crude but effective, favoring brute force over elegance. They were organized into clan-based hierarchies, with the strongest and most heavily modified individuals holding positions of authority. What made them particularly dangerous was their hive mind-like communication system. Each goblin was equipped with a neural transmitter that allowed instantaneous coordination across large groups. This made them incredibly effective in combat situations but also potentially vulnerable if their communication network could be disrupted. She spent the next several hours memorizing faces, names, and technical specifications. Every detail might be critical once she was on the ground. The Goblin command structure on Kepler 442c was headed by War Chief Scar, a massive cyborg whose body was more machine than flesh. Intelligence reports described him as cunning, ruthless, and surprisingly strategic for a species generally known for its preference for direct confrontation. A soft chime from her door interrupted her studies. "Come in," she called. Lieutenant Commander Jack Harrison entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing his characteristic easy smile. Jack was the Constellation's chief engineer, a friend from their academy days, and the closest thing to family Malaysia had in the fleet. "Burning the midnight oil again?" he asked, setting one of the cups on her desk. "Something like that." Malaysia accepted the coffee gratefully. "What brings you by?" "Heard through the grapevine that you're taking another one of your little vacation trips," Jack said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Thought you might want some company before you disappear for a few days." Malaysia couldn't help but smile. Jack had a gift for making dangerous situations sound like minor inconveniences. "Just a quick reconnaissance mission. Nothing too exciting." "Right. And I'm sure you'll be staying at luxury hotels and sampling the local cuisine." Jack's expression grew more serious. "How bad is it down there, Mel?" She considered how much she could tell him without violating operational security. "Bad enough. The Goblins aren't just occupying the planet, they're transforming it. Every hour we wait, they get stronger and our options get more limited. And they're sending you in alone?" "It's what I do, Jack. You know that." He nodded, but she could see the concern in his eyes. They had both lost too many friends over the years, and each mission carried the possibility that they might not see each other again. "I've been working on something," Jack said, reaching into his pocket and producing a small device about the size of a thumb drive. "Emergency transponder. Uses quantum entanglement for instantaneous communication, regardless of distance or interference." Malaysia examined the device. It was sleek and sophisticated, clearly not standard Imperial equipment. "How is this possible?" "Quantum communication systems require massive installations and enormous power sources. Let's just say I've been experimenting with some theoretical physics in my spare time," Jack replied with a grin. "The range is limited, maybe 500 kilometers, and it only works for about 30 seconds before the quantum state collapses. But if you're in serious trouble, it might buy you enough time to call for help." "Jack, this is—" She turned the device over in her hands, marveling at the workmanship. "This is incredible. But I can't take unauthorized equipment on a covert mission." "Then don't tell anyone about it," he said simply. "Consider it insurance." Malaysia looked at her friend, seeing the stubborn set of his jaw that she remembered from their academy days. Jack had always been protective of the people he cared about, sometimes to a fault. But his innovations had saved lives before, including her own. "Okay," she said finally, slipping the device into her pocket. "But if Admiral Zhao asks where I got it, I'm throwing you under the transport shuttle." "Fair enough." Jack stood, finishing his coffee. "Try to come back in one piece, will you? I'm getting tired of breaking in new mission partners." After he left, Malaysia returned to her studies, but found it difficult to concentrate. The weight of the upcoming mission pressed down on her like a physical burden. In less than 30 hours, she would be behind enemy lines on a world that had fallen to one of the most brutal alien species the Empire had ever encountered. She pulled up the personnel files for the Kepler 442c Colonial Administration, scrolling through the faces of people who were now dead, missing, or worse. Governor Patricia Williams, a veteran administrator who had turned a marginal mining outpost into a thriving colony. Dr. Marcus Chin, the chief geologist whose research had led to the discovery of the massive trilithium deposits. Sarah Kim, a teacher at the New Geneva Academy who had volunteered to spend her life educating the children of distant worlds. Each face represented a life interrupted, a future stolen by the Goblin invasion. Malaysia felt the familiar burn of anger in her chest, the emotion that had driven her through every dangerous mission of her career. The Empire wasn't perfect, no government ever was, but it represented something worth fighting for, the idea that different species could live together in peace, that knowledge and culture were more valuable than raw power, that the strong had a responsibility to protect the weak. The Goblins represented the opposite philosophy: might makes right, take what you can, and show no mercy to those who cannot defend themselves. It was a conflict that went beyond territory or resources. It was about what kind of civilization would inherit the galaxy. Malaysia finished her coffee and returned to the intelligence reports. Tomorrow would bring final preparations and last-minute briefings. In 36 hours, she would discover if all her training, experience, and determination would be enough to complete what might be the most important mission of her career. Outside her viewport, the stars wheeled slowly as the constellation maintained its position at the edge of the Kepler system. Somewhere among those distant points of light lay worlds that depended on the Empire for protection, trade, and the peaceful exchange of ideas that had defined human civilization for centuries. The outcome of her mission might determine whether those worlds remained free or fell under the shadow of Goblin domination. She would not let them down. The preparation bay of the ISV constellation bustled with quiet efficiency as technical specialists made final adjustments to Malaysia's infiltration gear. The stealth suit was a marvel of Imperial engineering, a form-fitting garment made from adaptive metamaterials that could mimic the optical and thermal properties of the surrounding environment. Integrated into the suit were life support systems, emergency medical supplies, and a sophisticated sensor package that would allow her to detect Goblin technology from a safe distance. The neural interface headset is calibrated to your specific brainwave patterns, technical specialist Rodriguez explained, fitting the device carefully over Malaysia's temples. The headset was almost invisible once in place, appearing as nothing more than a slight shimmer along her hairline. It should allow you to intercept and partially decode Goblin communications within a range of approximately 50 meters. Malaysia nodded, feeling the subtle tingle as the interface synchronized with her nervous system. The sensation was disconcerting, like having a conversation just at the edge of her hearing. "Remember," Rodriguez continued, "the Goblin communication system operates on quantum-encrypted frequencies. The interface can give you general emotional content and tactical information, but complex linguistic translation is beyond its capabilities." "Understood. What about the insertion pod?" Chief Engineer Harrison materialized at her elbow as if summoned. "Pod's ready for final systems check? I've made some modifications to the landing thrusters. They'll be quieter but with slightly less precision. You might have a rougher touchdown than usual." "Define rougher," Malaysia said, checking the seals on her equipment pouches. "Think of it as a controlled crash rather than a gentle landing," Jack replied with his characteristic grin. But hey, you've survived worse. Director Cross appeared at the entrance to the preparation bay, her expression as severe as ever. Captain Thorne, final briefing in 10 minutes. Latest intelligence updates from our deep space monitoring stations. As the technical team completed their final checks, Malaysia ran through her mental checklist one more time. Primary objective: locate and assess the supposed trilithium synthesis facility. Secondary objectives: determine the strength and positioning of Goblin defensive installations, identify potential weaknesses in their command structure, and gather any intelligence on their long-term strategic plans. The briefing room had been reconfigured with additional displays showing real-time sensor data from the Kepler system. Admiral Zhao stood beside a three-dimensional hologram of the planet, now updated with the latest intelligence. The situation has deteriorated since yesterday. He began without preamble. Long-range sensors have detected additional Goblin vessels arriving in system. It appears they're reinforcing their position more quickly than anticipated. Director Cross activated a new display showing ship configurations. 3 heavy cruisers and a dozen escort vessels have taken position in a defensive grid around the planet. More concerning is this. The display shifted to show a massive cylindrical structure in orbit. A orbital manufacturing platform. They're not just building a shipyard on the surface, they're constructing one in space as well. Malaysia studied the new intelligence, noting the implications. They're committing significant resources to this system. This isn't just a raid, it's a permanent occupation. Which makes your mission even more critical, Admiral Zhao replied. We need to know if they have the capability to produce trilithium. If they do, this system becomes their primary strategic asset. If they don't, we might be able to retake it with acceptable losses. The hologram zoomed in on the planet's surface, showing the latest updates to Goblin positions. New installations had appeared overnight: defensive bunkers, communication arrays, and what appeared to be surface-to-orbit missile batteries. The insertion point remains the same, Cross said, but your route to the primary target has changed. Goblin patrols have increased in the northern hemisphere. You'll need to approach from the south and move through these mountain ranges to avoid detection. Malaysia memorized the new route, noting potential choke points and areas where she might be vulnerable to aerial surveillance. The mission had just become significantly more dangerous. Any word on the civilian population? She asked. Admiral Zhao's expression darkened. Scattered reports from automated monitoring stations suggest that approximately 60% of the colonial population has been relocated to forced labor camps near the mining sites. The remainder. He gestured helplessly. The implications hung in the air like a physical weight. Malaysia had seen the aftermath of Goblin occupations before, entire populations systematically eliminated when they were no longer useful. The Empire had strict policies about negotiating with species that engaged in genocide, which meant that saving the remaining civilians would likely require military action. One more thing, Cross said, producing a small cylindrical device. This is a quantum data recorder. It's designed to survive almost any conceivable disaster: high temperatures, crushing pressure, electromagnetic pulses. If you can't make it to the extraction point, leave this recorder where our forces can find it. The intelligence you gather might still make the difference. Malaysia clipped the device to her belt beside the emergency transponder Jack had given her. The weight of both devices served as a reminder of just how dangerous this mission was expected to be. Any questions, Captain? Admiral Zhao asked. Rules of engagement? You are authorized to defend yourself as necessary, but your primary directive is intelligence gathering. Avoid direct confrontation unless absolutely unavoidable. The Goblins must not realize they've been infiltrated until after the extraction. Understood, sir. The insertion bay was a cathedral of gleaming metal and crackling energy fields as Malaysia approached the reconnaissance pod. The vehicle was sleek and angular, designed more for stealth than comfort. Its adaptive camouflage system was already active, making it appear to shimmer and shift like a mirage. Final systems check complete, announced the launch control officer. All green across the board. Malaysia climbed into the pod's cramped cockpit, feeling the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that preceded every dangerous mission. The interior was Spartanly functional: acceleration couch, instrument panel, emergency supplies, and little else. She would be spending the next several hours in this confined space as the pod carried her across the void to Kepler 442c. "Pod systems nominal," she reported as the canopy sealed with a soft hiss. "Ready for launch." Through the pod's viewport, she could see the launch bay's massive doors beginning to cycle open, revealing the starfield beyond. Somewhere among those points of light lay her destination, a world under siege, its people enslaved or dead, its resources being stripped away to fuel an alien war machine. "Launch in 60 seconds, the control officer announced. "Remember, Captain, you have exactly 17 minutes to reach the planet's surface before their sensor grid comes back online." "Copy that. See you in 3 days." The countdown proceeded with mechanical precision. Malaysia used the time to center herself, drawing on meditation techniques learned during her survival training. Fear was a useful tool if properly controlled, but panic was always fatal. She needed to be calm, focused, and ready for anything the mission might throw at her. Launch. The catapult system engaged with a bone-jarring acceleration that pressed Malaysia deep into her couch. The pod shot out of the Constellation's launch bay like a bullet from a rifle, its inertial dampeners straining to keep the sudden deceleration from turning her into paste against the bulkhead. Within seconds, the Imperial fleet had dwindled to distant points of light. The pod's navigation system engaged, adjusting course for the optimal insertion trajectory. At this distance, Kepler 442c was invisible to the naked eye, but the navigation display showed her destination as a growing amber icon against the black of space. "Pod Alpha 7, this is Control," came the voice of the launch officer over the communications system. "You are on optimal trajectory. Estimated time to insertion point, 4 hours, 27 minutes. Copy, Control. Beginning communication silence in 60 seconds. From this point forward, she would be on her own. The pod's communication systems would shut down to avoid detection, and she would have no contact with the fleet until she reached the extraction point. If something went wrong during the insertion, she would have to solve the problem herself, or die trying. The hours passed slowly as the pod coasted through the vacuum toward its destination. Malaysia used the time to review her mission parameters one final time, memorizing the locations of Goblin installations and potential safe zones. The planet's surface was an ever-changing puzzle of enemy positions and patrol routes that she would need to navigate with extreme care. As Kepler 442c grew larger in the viewport, Malaysia could see the scars the Goblin occupation had left on the world. The night side of the planet was lit up with the harsh glare of industrial installations, while the day side showed the geometric patterns of strip mining operations that had replaced the once green agricultural regions. 15 minutes to insertion, the pod's computer announced in its maddeningly calm voice. Beginning final approach sequence. The pod's stealth systems engaged with a subtle hum, bending electromagnetic radiation around the hull and masking its thermal signature. On Goblin sensors, the pod would appear as nothing more than a piece of space debris, assuming everything worked as designed. The planet's atmosphere reached up to embrace the pod with tendrils of superheated plasma as they began their descent. The adaptive camouflage system shifted to match the surrounding environment, and Malaysia felt the subtle vibration as the atmospheric entry systems engaged. Through the viewport, she could see the planet's surface rushing up to meet them. The insertion point was in a rugged mountain range far from any Goblin installations, but even so, the landing would need to be precise. Miss the target by more than a few kilometers, and she might find herself in the middle of an enemy patrol route. 5 minutes to insertion. Prepare for atmospheric entry. The pod shuddered as it hit the denser layers of the atmosphere, its heat shielding glowing cherry red from the friction. Malaysia gripped the armrests of her acceleration couch and tried to ignore the fact that she was essentially riding a barely controlled meteor toward the surface of a hostile world. 2 minutes to insertion. Landing systems nominal. The mountain range that was her destination had appeared on the horizon, a jagged line of peaks and valleys shrouded in the early morning mist. The pod's navigation system was guiding them toward a specific valley where the terrain would provide natural concealment from aerial surveillance. 30 seconds to insertion. Brace for impact. The pod's landing thrusters fired in a carefully choreographed sequence, bleeding off velocity and adjusting their trajectory for the final approach. Through the viewport, Malaysia could see individual trees and rock formations rushing past at alarming speed. The impact was everything Jack had promised and more, a bone-jarring crash that threw her against her restraints and filled the cockpit with the sound of stressed metal and emergency warnings. But the pod held together, and after a few moments, the various alarms fell silent. Landing successful, the computer announced with what seemed like surprised satisfaction. All systems nominal. Welcome to Kepler 442c. Malaysia released her restraints and began the pod's shutdown sequence. According to her chronometer, the entire insertion had taken just under 16 minutes, cutting it close, but within acceptable parameters. The pod's self-destruct system was now armed. If anyone other than Imperial personnel attempted to access it, the vehicle would vaporize itself and everything within a 50-meter radius. She gathered her equipment and activated the pod's egress system. The canopy lifted with a soft hiss, and she got her first breath of alien air. The atmosphere was thin but breathable, with a faint metallic taste that suggested high mineral content in the soil. The gravity felt noticeably lighter than Earth standard, which would be an advantage when moving through difficult terrain. The valley around her was silent except for the whisper of wind through the mountain peaks. No signs of goblin activity, no indication that her arrival had been detected. So far, so good. Malaysia checked her equipment one final time, activated the stealth suit's camouflage system, and began the long journey toward her target. Behind her, the pod's hull was already beginning to mimic the surrounding rock and vegetation, becoming virtually invisible from more than a few meters away. The mission clock was now running. She had 72 hours to penetrate goblin defenses, gather critical intelligence, and make it to the extraction point. The fate of millions of Imperial citizens, and possibly the future of the Empire itself, now rested on her shoulders. She disappeared into the alien wilderness like a ghost, leaving no trace of her passage. The trek through the mountains of Kepler 442c proved more challenging than Malaysia had anticipated. The terrain was rugged and unpredictable, with loose scree slopes that threatened to send her tumbling into ravines and dense patches of thorny vegetation that seemed designed to snag her stealth suit. After 6 hours of careful movement, she had covered only 20 kilometers of the 60-kilometer journey to her first objective. She paused on a rocky outcropping to check her position and survey the route ahead. The neural interface headset had remained silent throughout the morning, indicating no goblin activity in the immediate area. But as she studied the valley below through her enhanced optics, she caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. A goblin patrol crawler moved slowly along what had once been a colonial transport road, its sensor array sweeping the surrounding terrain in methodical patterns. The vehicle was a squat, heavily armored beast bristling with weapons and detection equipment. Even from a distance of several kilometers, Malaysia could see the characteristic heat shimmer of its power core and the geometric patterns of its electromagnetic shielding. She watched the patrol for nearly an hour, timing its movements and noting the range of its sensor sweeps. The goblins were being thorough, too thorough for comfort. Their search patterns suggested they were looking for something specific, possibly evidence of the Imperial infiltration. As the patrol moved out of sight around a bend in the valley, Malaysia's neural interface suddenly came alive with a burst of alien communication. The sensation was like having someone whisper urgently in a language she almost but not quite understood. Emotional undertones of alertness, suspicion, and methodical determination filtered through the quantum-encrypted transmission. More goblins were coming. She pressed herself against the rocks and activated her suit's full camouflage mode, becoming virtually invisible to both optical and thermal detection. Through the interface, she could sense the alien communications growing stronger, multiple voices now, coordinating their movements with military precision. 3 more patrol crawlers appeared at the mouth of the valley, moving in a coordinated search pattern that would bring them uncomfortably close to her position. Malaysia forced herself to remain perfectly still as the vehicles approached, their sensor arrays casting invisible nets of electromagnetic energy across the mountainside. The lead crawler passed within 50 meters of her hiding spot, close enough that she could hear the mechanical whirring of its sensor apparatus and see the individual details of its armor plating. Through the interface, she caught fragments of the crew's communication, satisfaction at finding no trace of intruders, orders to expand the search to the next valley system, urgency to complete their patrol before the next shift change. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, the patrol moved on. Malaysia waited until the alien voices faded from her neural interface before allowing herself to move. The close encounter had taught her several important lessons. The Goblins were taking security seriously, their technology was more sophisticated than intelligence had suggested, and her stealth systems worked well enough to fool their sensors at moderate ranges. She consulted her tactical map, and chose a new route that would take her through higher, more difficult terrain, but away from the obvious patrol routes. Speed was important, but staying undetected was critical. If the Goblins realized they had been infiltrated, her mission would be over before it began. The remainder of the day passed in careful movement through increasingly alien landscape. The native vegetation of Kepler 442c was unlike anything in the Imperial databases. Twisted trees with metallic bark that rang like chimes in the wind, flowering vines that seemed to glow with their own internal light, and patches of crystalline formations that refracted the sunlight into prismatic rainbows. But the beauty of the alien world was marred by signs of the Goblin occupation. Every few kilometers, she encountered evidence of their strip mining operations, vast scars in the earth where forests had been clear-cut and topsoil stripped away to reach the mineral deposits beneath. The streams ran muddy with runoff from the mining sites, and the air carried a faint chemical tang that spoke of industrial pollution. As the day progressed, Malaysia began to encounter more signs of the planet's former inhabitants. Abandoned farmsteads dotted the valleys, their fields now overgrown with weeds and their buildings showing the characteristic burn marks of Goblin plasma weapons. In one settlement, she found a small school where children's artwork still decorated the walls. Bright, innocent drawings of alien flowers and strange animals that would never be completed. The emotional weight of the destruction was almost overwhelming, but Malaysia forced herself to maintain professional detachment. Anger and grief were luxuries she couldn't afford while behind enemy lines. She documented what she found with her suit's recording systems and moved on. As evening approached, she reached the edge of the primary target zone. From her vantage point on a ridge overlooking the Harmon Valley, she could see the full scope of the Goblin occupation. The valley floor, which had once been home to the colony's capital city, was now a sprawling industrial complex of such scale that it defied immediate comprehension. Massive excavation sites stretched for kilometers in every direction, their depths illuminated by the harsh glare of industrial lighting. Automated mining equipment moved like mechanical insects through the excavations, loading raw materials onto transport vehicles that carried their cargo to processing facilities the size of small cities. But it was the structure at the center of the complex that captured Malaysia's attention. Rising from the valley floor like a metallic mountain was what could only be the trilithium synthesis facility, a towering edifice of alien architecture that pulsed with energy discharges and strange geometric patterns of light. Through her enhanced optics, she could see that the facility was heavily defended. Weapon emplacements dotted its perimeter, energy shields shimmered around critical installations, and patrol routes crisscrossed the approaches and overlapping patterns of surveillance. Getting close enough to gather detailed intelligence would require careful planning and no small amount of luck. Malaysia established a concealed observation post among the rocks and began the systematic process of cataloging the Goblin defenses. Her suit's sensors recorded everything: troop movements, vehicle types, communication frequencies, shift changes, and the subtle patterns of behavior that might reveal weaknesses in their security. As the alien sun set behind the mountains, the industrial complex came alive with even more activity. Work never stopped in the Goblin operation. Crews worked around the clock in rotating shifts, their activities coordinated by the omnipresent neural communication network that bound their society together. But what Malaysia observed through the neural interface was more disturbing than simple industrial efficiency. The emotional undertones of the Goblin communications carried notes of desperation, urgency, and something that might have been fear. They weren't just mining trilithium, they were racing against time to complete some larger objective. She spent the night in careful observation, mapping guard rotations and identifying potential infiltration routes. The facility was well defended, but no defense was perfect. The key would be finding the brief windows of opportunity when surveillance coverage overlapped, or when shift changes created temporary gaps in the security perimeter. As dawn broke over the alien landscape, Malaysia prepared for the most dangerous phase of her mission. Intelligence gathering from a distance was one thing, penetrating the heart of a heavily defended Goblin installation was something else entirely. But the facility's secrets were too important to the Empire's survival to be observed from afar. She would have to get inside.